Have you ever wondered why we sometimes make irrational decisions, even when we have all the necessary information at our fingertips? Perhaps the universe has led you here right now to shed light on this fascinating phenomenon. Thinking traps, also known as cognitive distortions, are systematic errors in thinking that impair our perception and judgment. These thinking errors often occur unconsciously and can arise for a variety of reasons, such as the need to make quick decisions, limited information processing capacity, or emotional influences. A classic example is the so-called confirmation bias, in which we prefer to look for and interpret information that confirms our existing beliefs. The importance of recognizing and avoiding thinking errors cannot be overstated. By becoming aware of these cognitive biases, you can make better decisions, communicate more effectively, and develop a deeper understanding of the world around you. The famous psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on decision-making, once said, "Nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you're thinking about it." This quote emphasizes the power of our thoughts and how much they can influence our lives. An overview of the most common thinking traps will help you prepare for this journey. Throughout this guide, you will come across thinking errors such as the confirmation bias, the availability heuristic, the hindsight bias, and many more. Each of these thinking traps has its own nuances and impact on our daily lives. Now let's get into the details. Next, let's talk about the confirmation bias, which is one of the most common and subtle thinking traps. You will discover how this error affects your perception and how you can recognize and avoid it in your daily life. The confirmation bias is one of the most common thinking traps that influence our thoughts and actions. This cognitive bias leads us to preferentially seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms our existing beliefs and assumptions. At the same time, we tend to ignore or devalue contradictory information. In everyday life, we encounter confirmation bias in many forms. A classic example is political conviction. People tend to choose news sources that support their political views and avoid information that challenges their views. Another example is investment behavior. Investors tend to seek information that supports their decision to invest in a particular stock, while overlooking negative news that might indicate risk. The impact of confirmation bias on our decision-making processes can be significant. It can lead to misjudgments as we develop a distorted perception of reality. In science, it can lead to researchers confirming hypotheses instead of testing them objectively. In professional life, confirmation bias can lead to managers making wrong decisions because they only consider the information that supports their preconceived ideas. There are several strategies you can use to avoid confirmation bias. One effective method is to consciously look for contradictory information. Ask yourself, what evidence is there against my assumptions, and what could challenge my beliefs? Another strategy is to seek different opinions and perspectives, especially from people who disagree with you. This helps you to get a more comprehensive picture of the situation. Keeping a decision journal can also be helpful. Make a note of your decisions and the underlying assumptions, as well as the information you have taken into account. Review these notes regularly and reflect on whether you may have succumbed to confirmation bias. This encourages more conscious and reflective thinking. Now that you better understand the confirmation bias and its effects, let's move on to another fascinating thinking error, the self-esteem bias. In this chapter, you'll discover how we tend to attribute successes to ourselves and failures to external circumstances, and how this affects our self-image and relationships. The self-esteem bias, known as self-serving bias, is a common thinking trap that strongly influences our perception and interpretation of events. This cognitive bias leads us to attribute successes to our own abilities and efforts, while we attribute failures to external factors or bad luck. This often happens unconsciously, as a mechanism to protect and strengthen our self-esteem. This bias has a profound impact on our self-image and our interpersonal relationships. If you attribute your successes exclusively to yourself while externalizing your failures, you can develop an overly positive self-image. This may boost your self-confidence in the short term, but can lead to problems in the long term as it deprives you of the opportunity to learn from your mistakes and develop further. In relationships, the self-esteem bias can lead to conflict as it limits your ability to self-reflect and take responsibility. A typical example of the self-esteem bias can be found in the world of work. Let's say you get a promotion. It's easy to see this as a result of your hard work and competence. However, if you fail at a project, it's tempting to blame external factors such as unclear instructions or lack of support. However, this behavior can lead to misunderstandings and tensions within the team as it gives the impression that you are not taking responsibility for your mistakes. Recognizing and countering self-esteem bias requires awareness and practice. One effective method is regular self-reflection. Ask yourself honestly, did I consider all the factors in this situation, and could I have done something differently? By objectively analyzing your successes and failures, you can develop a more balanced and realistic self-image. Another helpful approach is to get feedback from others. Talk to trusted colleagues, friends, or mentors and ask them for their honest opinion on your achievements. External feedback can help you identify blind spots in your self-perception and broaden your perspective. Practicing gratitude and humility can also help you overcome self-esteem bias. Recognize that your successes are often also the result of teamwork, support, and favorable circumstances. This fosters an attitude of gratitude and appreciation towards others while strengthening your capacity for self-reflection. Now that you've gained a deeper understanding of the self-esteem bias and its effects, let's move on to another fascinating thinking error, the availability heuristic. In this chapter, you'll discover how readily available information can distort our judgment and how to avoid this trap. The availability heuristic, another fascinating thinking trap, subtly influences our thinking and decision-making. This cognitive bias is based on the tendency to judge the likelihood of events by the ease with which examples can be recalled from memory. Put simply, the easier a particular event comes to mind, the more often we believe it will occur. An illustrative example of the availability heuristic can be found in the media. News about plane crashes is often reported intensively and in detail, which anchors them deeply in our memory. Although plane crashes are statistically rare, the intensive reporting leads many people to overestimate the danger of flying and possibly develop a fear of air travel. Another example is reporting on crime. When the media reports more on certain crimes, we tend to overestimate the frequency and risk of these crimes in our own neighborhoods. The availability heuristic is also evident in our personal lives. Imagine you have heard from several friends that they got food poisoning after eating mussels. Although shellfish poisoning is rare, you will probably be hesitant to eat shellfish because these negative experiences are easily recalled in your memory. This bias can significantly affect your risk assessment and lead to overly cautious or irrational decisions. The impact of the availability heuristic on our risk assessment and decision-making is far-reaching. When we rely on readily available information, we run the risk of misjudging risks and making suboptimal decisions. This can lead to problems in both personal and professional contexts. For example, managers who focus on recent problems may overlook long-term risks and thus set the wrong priorities. To overcome the availability heuristic, there are several techniques you can use. One effective method is to consciously search for statistical data and facts to support your decision-making. Instead of relying on individual examples or reports, check the actual frequencies and probabilities of events. This will help you gain a more objective perspective and make more informed decisions. Another approach is to train your critical thinking. Ask yourself, why do I think this event is likely, and what evidence do I have for this assumption? By questioning your own assumptions, you can uncover the biases created by the availability heuristic. Seeking different opinions and perspectives can also help you to recognize and overcome the biases. Talk to other people, especially experts in the field, to get a broader picture of the situation. This will broaden your horizons and reduce the influence of readily available but potentially misleading information. Now that you better understand the availability heuristic and its implications, let's move on to another thinking error, the hindsight bias. In this chapter, you'll discover how we tend to view past events as more predictable than they actually were, and how you can avoid this bias. The hindsight bias is a thinking trap that significantly distorts our perception of the past. This cognitive error leads us to believe that events were more predictable than they actually were. After an event occurs, we often think that we should have seen it coming, when in reality this was not the case. This distortion of our perception of the past can have a significant impact on our learning and decision-making processes. It diminishes our understanding of the uncertainties and complexities that exist in reality and leads us to underestimate the role of chance and unpredictability. Hindsight bias can also prevent us from learning from our mistakes because we believe that the outcome was inevitable anyway. A classic example of the hindsight bias is the stock market crash of 2008, when many people claimed to have recognized the signs of the impending crisis and that the crash was obvious. In reality, the financial crisis was a complex and difficult to predict development that was influenced by many factors. However, the hindsight bias gives the impression that events were clearer and more predictable than they actually were. Another example can be found in personal experience. Imagine you had a bad experience with a new project at work. In retrospect, you may think that you knew, from the beginning, that the project would fail. This hindsight bias can lead you to judge yourself or others too harshly without considering the actual uncertainties and challenges that led to the outcome. The consequences of hindsight bias are manifold. It can affect our confidence in our decision-making abilities and lead to excessive self-criticism. It can also distort the analysis and evaluation of decisions in companies and organizations by underestimating the role of chance and uncertainty in decision-making processes. There are several effective methods to avoid hindsight bias and look at past events more objectively. One important strategy is to keep a detailed diary or log of your decisions and the reasons that led to those decisions. This will help you document your initial thoughts and uncertainties and allow for a more realistic assessment later on. Another approach is to get feedback and different perspectives. Talk to others involved and look at the events from different angles to get a more comprehensive picture of the situation. This will help you to better understand the complexity and uncertainties that influence the events. Consciously reflecting on the role of chance and unpredictability in decision-making processes is also important. Accept that not all events are predictable and that even well-thought-out decisions can sometimes lead to unexpected results. This attitude promotes a realistic and balanced understanding of the past. Now that you better understand the hindsight bias and its implications, let's move on to another fascinating thinking error, the anchor effect. In this chapter, you'll discover how initial information can disproportionately influence our perceptions and decisions, and how you can overcome this bias. The anchor effect, also known as anchoring bias, is a common cognitive bias that strongly influences our judgment and decision-making processes. This thinking trap occurs when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information, the anchor, we receive when making an assessment or decision. Even if this information is irrelevant or random, it still influences our subsequent judgments and decisions. The anchor effect plays a particularly important role in negotiations and pricing. Imagine you are negotiating the price of a car. If the seller quotes a high starting price, this price will serve as an anchor and influence your perception, even if you know that the price is inflated. You will tend to make a counteroffer that is still close to the initial anchor instead of starting from a neutral or fairer starting point. You can also find a practical example of the anchor effect in everyday life, for example when shopping. If a shop advertises a product with an original, high price and a current discount price, the original price acts as an anchor. The discount price appears more attractive to you, even if the actual value of the product remains unchanged. This tactic is often used in sales strategies to manipulate the perception of value and savings. The impact of the anchor effect can be profound. Psychology and behavioral economics have repeatedly demonstrated that even random numbers used as anchors can distort our decisions. In one famous study, participants were asked to estimate the number of African countries in the United Nations after spinning a random number. The random number served as an anchor and significantly influenced their estimates, even when they knew the number was irrelevant. There are several strategies you can use to neutralize the anchor effect. One effective method is to consciously question the anchor. Recognize that the first value you receive may be irrelevant or manipulative and actively seek out further information and independent assessments. By considering multiple sources and perspectives, you can make a more informed and objective decision. Another approach is to prepare and set your own anchors. Before important negotiations or decisions, you should research thoroughly and set your own evaluation standards and anchor points. This helps you to avoid being influenced by external anchors and strengthens your negotiating position. Practicing mental calculation models can also be helpful. Train your brain to quickly calculate alternative scenarios and estimates in order to minimize the influence of a single anchor. This promotes more flexible and critical thinking and reduces dependence on initial information. Now that you better understand the anchor effect and its impact, let's move on to another interesting thinking error, the fundamental attribution error. In this chapter, you will discover how we often misinterpret the actions of others and what consequences this has for our social interactions. Fundamental attribution errors, also known as fundamental attribution errors, are deep-rooted cognitive biases that influence our interpretation and evaluation of other people's behavior. These errors occur when we attribute other people's actions to their personal characteristics, internal attribution, and underestimate the role of situational influences, external attribution. A classic example of this thinking error is when you see someone who is late for a meeting. You may tend to immediately attribute this to the person's unpunctuality or unreliability without considering that there may have been external factors such as traffic congestion or unexpected events that caused them to be late. This misjudgment can lead to misunderstandings and unfair judgments. The difference between internal and external attribution lies in the cause we assume for a person's behavior. With internal attribution, we attribute the behavior to the person's personality, attitudes, or abilities. With external attribution, on the other hand, we take into account the external circumstances and situational factors that may have influenced the behavior. In our example, the internal attribution could classify the person as unreliable, while the external attribution recognizes possible external reasons for the lateness. The effects of fundamental attribution errors on social interactions are manifold and often negative. This bias can lead to prejudice, misjudgment, and interpersonal tensions. By neglecting situational influences, we tend to judge people unfairly and attribute characteristics to them that may not be true. This can put a strain on relationships in both personal and professional contexts. There are some helpful methods to avoid this mental trap and assess situations correctly. One important strategy is to consciously reflect and question your first impressions. When evaluating someone's behavior, ask yourself, could external circumstances have influenced this behavior, and what information might I be missing to get the full picture? Another approach is to gather additional information. Before making a judgment, try to find out more about the situation and the circumstances that may have influenced the person's behavior. This can be done through direct communication with the person or by observing the context. Training empathy and changing perspective can also help to minimize the fundamental attribution errors. Try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and look at the situation from their perspective. This promotes a deeper understanding and can help you to make fairer and more balanced judgments. Now that you better understand the fundamental attribution errors and their effects, let's move on to another fascinating thinking error, cognitive dissonance. In this chapter, you will discover how we manage inner conflict and adjust our beliefs to achieve harmony in our thinking. Cognitive dissonance is a fascinating and often profound phenomenon that influences our thinking and behavior. This term describes the uncomfortable state of tension that arises when we hold contradictory beliefs, values, or behaviors simultaneously. When this dissonance occurs, we feel the urge to reduce it and regain cognitive consistency. A classic example of cognitive dissonance in everyday life is smoking. Many people know that smoking is harmful to health and increases the risk of serious illness. However, if a smoker continues to smoke, a cognitive dissonance arises between the knowledge of the harmful effects and the continued behavior. To reduce this dissonance, the smoker may try to downplay the health risk. I know many smokers who have grown very old, or justify the behavior. Smoking helps me to relieve stress. Another example can be found in the consumer world. Imagine you buy an expensive new smartphone even though your old device is still working well. After the purchase, you may feel a dissonance between your need to be frugal and your impulsive purchase. To reduce this dissonance, you could tell yourself that the new smartphone was urgently needed or that it is a wise investment in the long term. The psychological mechanisms for reducing cognitive dissonance are varied and often unconscious. One of the most common mechanisms is rationalization, in which we try to justify our behavior with logical but often self-deceptive explanations. Another mechanism is changing our beliefs. We adjust our beliefs so that they better match our behavior. In extreme cases, this can even lead us to ignore or distort evidence in order to reduce dissonance. There are several effective techniques for resolving inner conflicts and reducing cognitive dissonance. One important method is conscious reflection and introspection. Take time regularly to think about your beliefs and behaviors and question them critically. Ask yourself, why do I hold on to this belief, and are there valid reasons to change my behavior? Another approach is to change your behavior gradually. Instead of making drastic changes immediately, start with small, realistic steps that are in line with your beliefs. For example, if you're trying to live healthier, start with small adjustments like drinking more water or taking short walks before tackling bigger changes. Seeking feedback and support from others can also help you overcome cognitive dissonance. Talk to friends, family, or a mentor about your inner conflicts and listen to their perspectives. Often, outsiders can help you gain new insights and find solutions. Now that you have gained a deeper understanding of cognitive dissonance and its mechanisms, let's move on to another interesting thinking error, the status quo bias. In this chapter, you will discover how the tendency to maintain the current state influences our decisions and how you can overcome this bias. The status quo bias is a cognitive bias that strongly influences our decision-making processes and willingness to change. This thinking trap describes our tendency to favor the current state and avoid change, even when alternative options are objectively better. This bias often occurs because the status quo is perceived as safe and familiar, while change is perceived as risky and uncertain. One example of this is the choice of job. Many people stay in an unsatisfying job because they prefer the security of the familiar to the risk of a new, unknown position, even if it could potentially be more fulfilling and better paid. The influence of status quo bias on decision-making processes is far-reaching. In business, this can lead to companies avoiding necessary innovations and changes, which jeopardizes their competitiveness in the long term. In personal life, the bias can cause people to persist in unhealthy relationships or lifestyles because they are afraid of the unknown. Another vivid example of status quo bias is the behavior of voters in political elections. Many voters tend to favor the incumbent candidate, even when alternative candidates offer better solutions or programs. This is often because voters view the current state of affairs as familiar and stable, while new candidates bring uncertainty. The consequences of status quo bias can be significant. It can lead to stagnation and prevent us from making better choices that could improve our lives and circumstances. This bias also hinders personal and professional growth as it prevents us from seizing opportunities and facing new challenges. There are various strategies you can use to overcome the status quo bias. One important method is to consciously weigh up the pros and cons of each option. Make a list of the potential benefits and risks of both the status quo and the alternatives. This will help you to make a more objective assessment and put the fear of change into perspective. Another approach is to experiment with small changes. Instead of taking big steps right away, start with small, controllable changes that help you get used to new situations and gain positive experience. This can boost your confidence in your ability to deal with change. Getting feedback and perspectives from others can also help you overcome the status quo bias. Talk to people who have successfully managed similar changes and learn from their experiences. This can give you courage and show you that change is often less threatening than it seems. Another useful approach is to visualize success scenarios. Imagine what your life could look like if you dare to make the change and implement it successfully. This positive visualization can help you overcome the fear of the unknown and motivate you to take the first step. Now that you better understand the status quo bias and its effects, let's move on to another important thinking error, the sunk cost fallacy. In this chapter, you'll discover how the tendency to continue investing in already invested resources influences our decisions and how you can avoid this trap. The sunk cost fallacy, also known as the cost trap or sunk cost fallacy, is a common thinking trap that affects both financial and personal decisions. This cognitive bias occurs when we hold on to investments that have already been made, regardless of whether they continue to make sense in the future. The fallacy is that we are guided by sunk costs instead of looking at future benefits and the best available alternatives. A classic example of the sunk cost fallacy can be found in the area of finance. Imagine you have invested a lot of money in a failed project. Instead of ending the project and accepting the losses, you decide to invest even more money in the hope that it will eventually pay off. This decision is not made by rationally weighing up the future prospects of success, but by the desire not to make the investments already made appear lost. The sunk cost fallacy is also frequently seen in the personal sphere. Imagine you have been in an unhappy relationship for many years. You have invested a lot of time and emotion in this relationship and don't want these investments to have been in vain. You therefore decide to stay in the relationship, even though it is not good for you and offers no positive prospects. This is where the sunk cost fallacy traps you by valuing past investments over your future well-being. The impact of the sunk cost fallacy on financial and personal decisions can be significant. In financial matters, it often leads to additional losses and poor allocation of resources. Instead of abandoning failed projects or investments, good resources continue to be thrown at bad ones. In personal matters, this trap of thinking can lead people to persist in unhealthy situations, affecting their long-term well-being and quality of life. To avoid the sunk cost fallacy, there are several practical tips. One important method is to regularly reevaluate your investments and decisions. Ask yourself, would I make this decision again today, under the current circumstances, and what is the future benefit of this decision? By basing your decisions on future benefits rather than past costs, you can make more rational and effective decisions. Another approach is to develop a clear exit plan. Set clear criteria in advance for when you should end a project or investment. This will help you stay objective and not get emotionally attached to sunk costs. For example, an investor might decide to sell a stock when it falls below a certain value, regardless of how much has already been invested. Seeking outside opinions can also be helpful. Talk to friends, mentors, or financial advisors who are not emotionally attached to the investments you have made. Their objective perspective can help you see more clearly and make better decisions. Now that you better understand the sunk cost fallacy and its implications, let's move on to another fascinating thinking error, the halo effect. In this chapter, you'll discover how our perception of one positive trait in a person disproportionately influences our judgment of their other traits. The halo effect is a common cognitive bias that strongly influences our perception and judgment of other people. This thinking error occurs when a positive characteristic of a person disproportionately colors our perception of their other characteristics. The term halo effect comes from the English word halo, which describes the halo that is often seen above the head of saints in depictions, symbolizing a radiant, all-encompassing positive perception. The halo effect can characterize our social and professional interactions in many ways. A typical example from professional life is the assessment of employees. For example, if an employee is very good at a particular skill or has an impressive physical appearance, we tend to judge their other skills and character traits more favorably. A good-looking and eloquent colleague might be perceived as more competent and reliable, even if their actual performance does not fully justify this. Another example can be found in the education sector. Teachers often rate students who excel in one subject better in other subjects, even if their performance there is not exceptional. This effect can influence the fairness and objectivity of the assessment and lead to undeserved advantages or disadvantages. The halo effect also plays an important role in a social context. People tend to view attractive people as friendlier, more intelligent, and more successful. This perception can strongly distort interactions and judgments in social groups and relationships. The effects of the halo effect are far-reaching and can lead to unfair judgments and decisions. In the workplace, the halo effect can lead to less qualified individuals being favored based on their overall positive impression, while qualified but less impressive individuals are overlooked. In social relationships, this effect can lead to unequal opportunities and misunderstandings. There are several helpful techniques to overcome the halo effect and judge people more objectively. One important method is to consciously separate the evaluation of individual characteristics. Try to evaluate each characteristic or ability of a person independently, without allowing yourself to be influenced by other positive or negative characteristics. This promotes a differentiated and fairer judgment. Another approach is to get different opinions and perspectives. Talk to other people who also have an opinion about the person in question and compare their assessments with your own. This can help you to recognize and compensate for possible distortions caused by the halo effect. Keeping structured evaluation sheets can also be helpful. Create a list of specific criteria that are relevant to the assessment and rate each characteristic separately. This method forces you to look at each skill and trait more objectively and minimizes the risk of the halo effect distorting your overall assessment. Now that you better understand the halo effect and its implications, let's move on to another common thinking error, the planning fallacy. In this chapter, you will discover how unrealistic time and resource planning can affect our projects and endeavors, and how you can avoid this trap. The planning fallacy, also known as the planning fallacy, is a common cognitive bias that severely impairs our ability to realistically plan time and resources. This thinking trap occurs when we systematically underestimate the duration and effort required for tasks and projects, which often leads to delays and unexpected difficulties. There are many reasons for the planning fallacy. One of the main causes is our natural optimism. We tend to overestimate our own abilities and efficiency, while underestimating potential obstacles and challenges. This optimism leads us to assess projects more positively than reality often allows. Another reason is the so-called focusing tendency. When planning, we often concentrate only on the specific tasks and forget that there may also be unforeseen events and distractions that require additional time. An illustrative example of the planning fallacy can be found in the construction industry. Many construction projects, be it a new office building or an infrastructure project, often take longer and cost more than originally planned. This is often because planners underestimate the complexity and potential problems of the project, leading to significant delays and cost overruns. We also regularly encounter the planning fallacy in our personal lives. Imagine you are planning to renovate your living room. You estimate that the work will take 2 weeks and cost a certain budget. However, unexpected problems arise during the renovation, such as damaged pipes or missing materials, which significantly increase the time and costs involved. This situation shows how easily we underestimate the cost of projects and the consequences this can have. The consequences of planning errors are manifold and can be considerable. Delays often lead to frustration and stress, both at work and at home. In the business world, unrealistic planning can jeopardize the efficiency and success of projects, leading to financial losses and missed opportunities. To avoid the planning fallacy and create more realistic plans, there are several strategies you can use. One effective method is to include buffer time. Consciously plan extra time for unexpected events and delays. These buffer times help you to react more flexibly to problems and still stay on schedule. Another approach is to learn from the past. Analyze previous projects and tasks to develop realistic estimates for future projects. Look at the actual duration and effort of previous projects and use this information to adjust your plans. Obtaining opinions and estimates from others can also be helpful. Talk to colleagues, experts, or friends who have carried out similar projects and ask for their experiences and estimates. These additional perspectives can help you to develop a more realistic estimate. Another useful approach is the so-called reference class forecast. In this method, you compare your current project with similar projects that have already been completed and use their results as the basis for your planning. This technique helps to reduce the influence of optimism and create more realistic time and cost plans. Now that you better understand the planning fallacy and its implications, let's move on to another common thinking mistake: confusing correlation and causation. In this chapter, you'll discover how easily we can misunderstand correlations and how you can avoid this trap. The difference between correlation and causality is an essential aspect of interpreting data and analyzing relationships. Correlation describes a relationship between two variables that vary together. However, this does not mean that one variable causes the other. Causality, on the other hand, implies that a change in one variable directly causes a change in another variable. Confusing these two concepts is a common cognitive bias that can lead to misinterpretation and false conclusions. An example from science illustrates this mental trap. Let's say a study finds that people who eat more ice cream also have more sunburns. These two variables are correlated, but it would be wrong to conclude that ice cream causes sunburns. In fact, there is a third variable, hot weather, that influences both ice cream consumption and the incidence of sunburns. This demonstrates the importance of distinguishing between correlation and causation. We often encounter this confusion in everyday life too. Imagine reading a report that says people who practice yoga daily are less likely to suffer from heart disease. It would be tempting to believe that yoga directly prevents heart disease. However, it could be that people who practice yoga also maintain other healthy lifestyle habits, such as a balanced diet and regular exercise, which reduce the risk of heart disease. Without this further information, the assumption of direct causality between yoga and heart health would be premature. The risks of confusing correlation and causation are significant. They can lead to incorrect assumptions and decisions, both in a scientific and in a personal and professional context. In medicine, the misinterpretation of correlation could lead to ineffective or even harmful treatments. In business, companies could adopt the wrong strategies because they misinterpret correlations as causal relationships. To ensure the correct interpretation of data and avoid confusion between correlation and causation, there are several proven methods. One important method is to critically scrutinize and review studies and data sources. Ask yourself, is there a plausible third variable that could influence both observed phenomena, and has the relationship been replicated in different studies? These questions will help you to identify possible alternative explanations and avoid jumping to conclusions. Another approach is to conduct experiments. In contrast to observational studies, which only detect correlations, experiments can uncover causal relationships by creating controlled conditions and testing the effect of one variable on another. This is particularly important in science in order to achieve robust and reliable results. Learning and applying statistical methods to control confounding variables can also help you to distinguish causal relationships from mere correlations. Techniques such as regression analysis allow you to take into account the influence of multiple variables and better understand which factors actually have a causal effect. Another important approach is to understand and apply the Bradford-Hill criteria, a set of principles for evaluating causal relationships in epidemiology. These criteria, such as strength of association, consistency of observations, and temporal order, provide a structured framework for distinguishing causality from correlation. Now that you better understand the difference between correlation and causation and the risks of confusing them, let's move on to another interesting error in thinking: the illusion of control. In this chapter, you'll discover how we often overestimate our ability to influence and control events and how you can avoid this bias. The illusion of control, also known as the illusion of control, is a common cognitive distortion in which people believe they can influence or control events that are actually largely dependent on chance. This illusion can lead us to overestimate our ability to control outcomes and become careless in our decision-making. A classic example of the illusion of control can be found in gambling. Imagine playing a slot machine and being convinced that your actions, such as the speed at which you pull the lever or the number of coins you insert, can influence the outcome. In reality, the outcomes of slot machines are purely random, but the illusion of control can lead you to play more and lose more money than you originally intended. Another example can be found in stock market analysis. Investors often believe that by carefully analyzing and selecting stocks, they can predict and control market performance. While knowledge and experience can certainly help to make more informed decisions, a significant portion of market movements remain unpredictable and beyond the control of individual investors. This overestimation of one's own control can lead to risky investment decisions and financial losses. The psychological underpinnings of the illusion of control are deeply rooted in our need for certainty and predictability. People have a strong desire to understand and control the world around them, as this provides a sense of security and well-being. The illusion of control can therefore be seen as a mechanism that helps us to deal with uncertainty and chance. In addition, people tend to attribute successes to their own abilities and decisions, while blaming failures on external factors. This self-esteem bias reinforces the illusion that we have more control over our environment than is actually the case. There are several effective techniques to overcome the illusion of control and develop a more realistic assessment of your ability to control. One important method is to consciously reflect on and question your beliefs about control. Ask yourself, do I really have influence over this outcome, or does chance play a bigger role, and what factors are beyond my control? These questions will help you to better recognize the limits of your influence. Another approach is to learn from experience and mistakes. Analyze situations in which you believed you had control, but the outcome was determined by chance or external factors. Reflect on what you can learn from this and how you can make a more realistic assessment in the future. Getting feedback and perspectives from others can also be helpful. Talk to colleagues, friends, or mentors about your decisions and ask for their assessment. External opinions can help you uncover blind spots in your perception and develop a more balanced view of your control options. Another technique is to apply statistical and probabilistic thinking. By incorporating probabilities and statistics into your decision-making processes, you can gain a more realistic assessment of the influencing factors. This promotes differentiated thinking and reduces the tendency to overestimate your own control. Now that you better understand the illusion of control and its effects, let's move on to another common thinking error, the optimism and pessimism error. In this chapter, you will discover how these biases affect our risk assessment and decision-making processes and how you can find a balanced middle ground. The optimism and pessimism biases are two common cognitive biases that influence our perception of risks and opportunities. The optimism bias leads us to overestimate the probability of positive events and underestimate the probability of negative events. Conversely, the pessimism bias leads us to overestimate the probability of negative events and underestimate the probability of positive events. Both thinking errors can significantly distort our decision-making processes. The impact of these biases on risk assessment and decision-making processes is profound. People who are prone to the optimism bias may tend to underestimate risks and be overly optimistic about their abilities and future performance. This can lead to excessive risk-taking and imprudent decisions. Conversely, people prone to the pessimism bias may overestimate risks and overlook opportunities, leading to cautious and sometimes paralyzing decision-making. An example of the optimism bias can be found in the area of starting a business. Many entrepreneurs are overly optimistic about the prospects for success of their new businesses. They underestimate the challenges and risks and overestimate the market opportunities. This overoptimism can lead to a lack of preparation and ultimately to the failure of the business. A well-known quote from entrepreneur Richard Branson reads, "You can't sail a boat full of holes, no matter how big your bucket is." This quote emphasizes the need for realistic planning and risk assessment. An example of the pessimism mistake can be seen in the area of personal finance. Someone who is pessimistic might refuse to invest in the stock market for fear of losses, even though historical data shows that stocks offer good long-term returns. This excessive caution can lead to the person missing out on potential gains and their wealth not growing optimally. The impact of these biases can be significant. Optimism biases can lead to financial losses, failed projects, and unrealistic expectations. Pessimism biases can lead to missed opportunities, stifled innovation, and limited personal growth. There are several strategies to achieve a realistic middle ground and avoid both optimism and pessimism mistakes. One important method is the use of scenario planning. Develop different scenarios for possible future developments, including optimistic, pessimistic, and realistic scenarios. This will help you gain a more balanced perspective and be prepared for different outcomes. Another approach is to seek feedback and conduct peer reviews. Discuss your plans and decisions with trusted colleagues, friends, or mentors who can bring different perspectives to the table. These external perspectives can help you uncover blind spots in your perception and make a more balanced assessment of risks and opportunities. Applying probabilistic thinking can also be helpful. By incorporating probabilities and statistics into your decision-making processes, you can gain a more objective assessment of risks and opportunities. This promotes differentiated and balanced thinking. In addition, the practice of mindfulness and self-reflection can help you to recognize and correct your own tendencies towards optimism or pessimism. Regularly take time to reflect on your decisions and their outcomes. Ask yourself, was my judgment realistic, and how can I improve my future judgments? Now that you better understand the optimism and pessimism errors and their effects, let's move on to another fascinating thinking error, the Dunning-Kruger effect. In this chapter, you will discover how our self-perception and knowledge of our abilities are often distorted and what consequences this can have. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a fascinating cognitive bias that describes how people with low knowledge or competence in a particular area often overestimate their abilities, while more competent people tend to underestimate their abilities. This effect was first described by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger and has far-reaching implications for our self-perception and performance. An illustrative example of the Dunning-Kruger effect can be found in the field of education. Pupils or students who only have a superficial knowledge of a subject can often feel confident and overconfident in their understanding. This can lead them to underestimate the complexity of the subject and the depth of knowledge required. Conversely, experts who are deeply immersed in a topic may question their own expertise because they have a better understanding of the complexity and limitations of their knowledge. This is often referred to as the paradox of knowledge. The more you know, the more you realize how little you actually know. The Dunning-Kruger effect is also frequently seen in a professional context. An employee with limited experience may believe they are ready for a leadership position because they do not fully understand the challenges and requirements of the role. At the same time, an experienced and competent colleague who is aware of the many facets and difficulties of the role may underestimate their own suitability for the position. This can lead to unwarranted self-confidence on the one hand and unnecessary self-doubt on the other. The impact of the Dunning-Kruger effect on self-perception and performance can be significant. People who overestimate their abilities may make risky decisions for which they are not qualified, which can lead to mistakes and failures. At the same time, competent individuals who underestimate their abilities may miss valuable opportunities and fail to realize their full potential. To overcome the Dunning-Kruger effect and develop a more realistic self-perception, there are several effective strategies. One important method is continuous self-reflection and seeking feedback. Regularly ask for constructive feedback from colleagues, mentors, and superiors. This external feedback can help you gain a more objective assessment of your skills and recognize blind spots in your self-perception. Another approach is to consciously strive for further training and skills development. Recognize the limits of your knowledge and actively seek opportunities to expand your skills. This can be done through formal training, courses, workshops, or self-taught learning. By continuously learning and developing yourself, you can develop a more realistic assessment of your abilities. Practicing humility and openness to new experiences can also help you to overcome the Dunning-Kruger effect. Recognize that knowledge and competence are always in flux and that there is always more to learn. This attitude promotes lifelong learning and helps you to better understand both your strengths and your weaknesses. Another useful approach is to regularly assess your progress and achievements. Set yourself clear, measurable goals and review your progress regularly. This will help you to develop a realistic assessment of your skills and identify areas where you can improve. Now that you have a better understanding of the Dunning-Kruger effect and its implications, let's move on to another interesting thinking error, the overconfidence bias. In this chapter, you will discover how overconfidence affects our decision-making processes and what strategies can help you maintain a realistic self-image. Overconfidence bias, or overconfidence, is a common cognitive bias in which people overestimate their own abilities, knowledge, or judgment. This bias can lead us to make overly risky decisions and underestimate the complexity and uncertainty of situations. The causes of overconfidence are manifold. One main cause is the human tendency toward self-esteem. We tend to evaluate our own abilities and knowledge more favorably in order to protect and strengthen our self-image. Another problem is selective perception, where we tend to remember and emphasize successes, while ignoring or trivializing failures and mistakes. These distortions lead us to develop an unrealistically positive image of our abilities and decisions. A vivid example of overconfidence bias can be found in the world of finance. Many investors overestimate their ability to beat the market and make excessively risky investment decisions. They believe that they are better than average and tend to underestimate the risks and uncertainties of the markets. This can lead to significant financial losses if the markets perform differently than expected. We also frequently encounter the overconfidence bias in everyday life. For example, a driver may overestimate their driving skills and carry out risky overtaking maneuvers because they believe they can react better and faster than other road users. This overconfidence can cause dangerous situations and increase the risk of accidents. The risks of overconfidence are considerable. It can lead to bad decisions, excessive risks, and ultimately to failure and loss. Overconfidence can also lead to conflicts and misunderstandings in social and professional relationships, as one's own opinion is overemphasized and the perspectives of others are devalued. There are several effective techniques to promote a more realistic self-image and avoid the overconfidence bias. One important method is conscious reflection and obtaining feedback. Regularly ask for honest and constructive feedback from colleagues, friends, and mentors. This feedback helps you to gain a more objective assessment of your skills and decisions and to recognize blind spots in your self-perception. Another approach is the use of decision aids and checklists. Through structured and methodical approaches, you can ensure that all relevant factors and risks are considered before you make a decision. This reduces the likelihood of relying solely on your overconfidence. Being aware of the limits of your own knowledge and abilities can also help you to develop a more realistic self-image. Recognize that no one is omniscient or infallible and actively seek out information and perspectives that will broaden and enrich your outlook. Another useful approach is to keep a decision diary. Write down your important decisions, the reasons behind them and the results. Regularly analyze these notes to identify patterns and learn from mistakes. This practice encourages continuous learning and helps you to develop a more balanced and realistic self-image. Now that you better understand the overconfidence bias and its effects, let's move on to another interesting thinking error, groupthink. In this chapter, you will discover how group decisions can be influenced by conformist thinking and what strategies can help you foster critical thinking in groups. Groupthink is a phenomenon in which the desire for harmony and agreement within a group leads to irrational or dysfunctional decision-making processes. This phenomenon occurs when group members prioritize consensus over critical thinking and realistic evaluation of alternatives, often resulting in poor decisions. A classic example of groupthink can be found in the history of space travel. The Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986 is a tragic example of how groupthink can have fatal consequences. Despite several technical warning signs and concerns from engineers pointing to the risk of launch temperatures, NASA management decided to go ahead with the launch to meet the schedule and alleviate public pressure. The decision to ignore critical concerns and follow the consensus led to the explosion of the space shuttle and the deaths of all 7 crew members. Another example from the business world is the case of Enron. The management and culture within Enron fostered an environment where dissent and critical voices were suppressed. This culture of groupthink contributed to risky and illegal business decisions being made that ultimately led to the collapse of the company and caused one of the biggest financial scandals in U.S. history. The risks and consequences of groupthink are significant. Groups that fall prey to groupthink tend to underestimate risks, ignore warning signs and fail to consider alternative courses of action. This can lead to serious mistakes that can affect not only the group itself, but also external stakeholders and society as a whole. In addition, groupthink fosters a culture of conformity and inhibition of innovation, as dissenting opinions and creative thinking are suppressed. There are several effective strategies to avoid groupthink and promote critical thinking in groups. One important method is to promote an open and inclusive group culture. Encourage all group members to openly express their opinions and concerns without fear of reprisal or rejection. Create an atmosphere where dissenting views and constructive criticism are welcome and valued. Another approach is to appoint an advocatus diaboli, or devil's advocate. This person has the task of deliberately presenting counterarguments and alternative perspectives in order to get the group to critically scrutinize their assumptions and decisions. This helps to improve the quality of decision-making and uncover potential risks and weaknesses. Introducing structured decision-making processes can also be helpful. Use techniques such as brainstorming, nominal group technique or Delphi method to ensure that all opinions and ideas are heard and that decision-making is based on a broad base of information and perspectives. Another effective strategy is to regularly evaluate and reflect on past decisions. Analyze how decisions were made and what results were achieved. Identify instances of groupthink and learn from them to improve future decision-making processes. Now that you better understand the phenomenon of groupthink and its effects, let's move on to another interesting thinking error, the framing effect. In this chapter, you will discover how the way information is presented can influence our decisions and how you can avoid this bias. The framing effect, also known as the frame effect, describes the tendency for people to make decisions and judgments differently depending on the way information is presented. This effect shows that the context and framing of information can have a significant impact on our perception and decision-making, even if the core content of the information remains unchanged. The influence of context and presentation on decisions is profound. By framing the same information differently, the perception and associated decision can be greatly altered. For example, a message that emphasizes the positive aspects of a decision can lead to a very different reaction than a message that emphasizes the negative aspects, even though the underlying facts are identical. An illustrative example of the framing effect can be found in marketing. Imagine a product is advertised in two different ways: 90% fat-free versus contains 10% fat. Although both statements mean the same thing, the fat-free formulation is likely to be perceived as healthier and more attractive, which can positively influence the purchase decision. This technique is often used to present products in a more favorable light and influence consumers. The framing effect is also frequently used in politics. A politician could present a new tax increase either as a necessary measure to ensure public services or as an additional burden for taxpayers. The wording chosen strongly influences how the measure is perceived by the public. Positive frames can generate support, while negative frames can provoke resistance. Recognizing and neutralizing the framing effect requires mindfulness and critical thinking. One effective method is to consciously question the presentation of information. Ask yourself, how would I perceive this information if it were formulated differently, and what is the actual core of the information, regardless of how it is presented? These questions will help you to recognize the actual facts and not be influenced by the framing. Another approach is to seek alternative formulations and perspectives. Look for different sources that present the same information differently and compare the presentations. This can help you develop a more balanced and comprehensive understanding of the situation. Training in logical and statistical thinking can also help to reduce the framing effect. By learning to evaluate information analytically and critically, you can better distinguish between the presentation and the content. Techniques such as creating lists of pros and cons or using decision trees can help you to make structured and objective decisions. Another useful approach is the practice of self-reflection. Regularly take time to think about your decision-making processes and examine whether and how the framing effect has influenced your perception. This reflection fosters a deeper awareness of your own susceptibility to cognitive biases and strengthens your ability to make informed and balanced decisions. Now that you better understand the framing effect and its implications, let's move on to another interesting thinking error, the negativity bias. In this chapter, you will discover why negative events and information often have a stronger influence on us than positive ones and how you can compensate for this bias. Negativity bias, also known as negativity bias, is a cognitive bias in which negative events, information and emotions have a stronger influence on our thinking and behavior than positive ones. This tendency to prioritize negatives over positives can distort our perception of reality and affect our emotional well-being. The explanation for the negativity bias is deeply rooted in human evolution. In prehistoric times, it was crucial for survival to quickly recognize and avoid threats and dangers. The human brain therefore developed a greater sensitivity to negative stimuli. However, in the modern world, where immediate danger is less common, this survival strategy often has a negative impact on our emotional and mental well-being. Negative events have a stronger impact than positive ones because they trigger more intense emotional reactions. A negative comment or bad news can ruin our day, while positive events such as compliments or successes often have a less strong and less lasting effect. This asymmetry in emotional response means that negative experiences are remembered for longer and have a stronger influence on our behavior and decisions. An illustrative example of the negativity bias can be found in the news media. News reports tend to emphasize negative events such as accidents, crimes, or natural disasters because they attract more attention and elicit stronger emotional responses. This can lead to a distorted worldview in which the world appears more dangerous and threatening than it actually is. The negativity bias is also clearly evident in our personal lives. Imagine you receive feedback on a project you've been working on. If you receive 9 positive comments and 1 negative comment, you will probably pay more attention to the negative comment and be more annoyed by it than happy about the positive comments. This tendency can affect your self-esteem and motivation. The consequences of negativity bias are manifold and can have a significant impact on our well-being and interpersonal relationships. It can lead to excessive anxiety, pessimism and stress, which in turn affects our health and quality of life. In relationships, the focus on negative aspects can exacerbate conflicts and reduce trust and satisfaction. There are several effective strategies to offset negativity bias and promote a positive perspective. One important method is the conscious practice of gratitude. Regularly take time to reflect on and appreciate the positive aspects of your life. Keep a gratitude diary in which you write down at least 3 things you are grateful for every day. This practice can help to focus your attention on the positive and strengthen your emotional well-being. Another approach is positive self-talk and affirmations. Replace negative thought patterns with positive and constructive statements. For example, instead of thinking, "I am not good enough," tell yourself, "I have skills and talents that are valuable." This rephrasing can improve your self-image and strengthen your resilience to negative influences. Consciously reflecting on positive events can also be helpful. Take time to think about successful projects, enjoyable experiences, and positive feedback. Celebrate your successes, even the small ones, and share positive experiences with others. This practice promotes a balanced and positive self-image. Another useful approach is to consciously reduce your consumption of negative media content. Limit your exposure to negative news and content that promotes fear and pessimism. Instead, seek out positive and inspiring stories that convey hope and confidence. Now that you better understand the negativity bias and its effects, let's move on to another fascinating thinking error, the gambler's fallacy. In this chapter, you will discover how the false assumption that future events are influenced by past events distorts our decision-making processes and how you can avoid this trap. The gambler's fallacy, also known as the gambler's fallacy, is a common cognitive bias in which people mistakenly believe that future random events are influenced by past events. This thinking error often occurs in gambling, but can also influence other decision-making processes in which probabilities play a role. The influence of the gambler's fallacy on gambling is well documented. Imagine you are playing roulette and you notice that the ball has landed on black 5 times in a row. The gambler's fallacy would lead you to believe that the probability of the ball landing on red on the next roll is higher because you think that luck must be equalized. In reality, the probabilities of each throw are independent of the previous events, and the chances of the ball landing on red or black remain the same. The gambler's fallacy can also play a role in other decision-making processes. Let's take the example of investors trading on the stock market. If a share has fallen continuously over a long period of time, they may mistakenly believe that it must rise soon because it has fallen for too long. This assumption ignores the fundamental factors that influence share prices and is based solely on a misunderstood concept of probability. The psychological underpinnings of the gambler's fallacy lie in the human tendency to recognize patterns and see order in random events. Our brains are constantly searching for explanations and predictability, even in situations that are purely random. This cognitive tendency can lead to irrational beliefs and decisions based on false assumptions about probabilities. There are several effective techniques to avoid the gambler's fallacy and develop a more realistic assessment of probabilities. One important method is to learn and apply basic concepts of probability theory. By understanding that independent random events have no memory and that past events have no influence on future events, you can rationalize your decision-making processes. Another approach is to raise awareness of the independence of events. Remember that in many situations, like flipping a coin or playing roulette, each event is independent of the previous ones. This realization helps you to avoid false pattern recognition and irrational expectations. Critically questioning your beliefs and assumptions can also be helpful. Ask yourself, why do I believe that this event is more likely, and is my assessment based on actual data or on a misinterpretation of the probabilities? This reflection can help you to recognize and correct irrational beliefs. Another useful approach is to apply statistical and analytical methods in your decision-making processes. Use data and statistical modeling to make informed decisions rather than relying on intuitive assumptions and irrational beliefs. These methods promote more objective and rational thinking. Now that you better understand the gambler's fallacy and its effects, you have gained a comprehensive overview of the most common thinking errors and cognitive biases. These insights will help you to make your decisions more consciously and rationally by recognizing and avoiding the various thinking traps. Remember that critical thinking and self-reflection are key to minimizing the power of cognitive biases and making informed decisions.